Welcome everyone to the third edition of the seminar series on Sephardi modernities, co-sponsored by the Schusterman Center for Israel Studies at Brandeis University and the Bellsberg Program for Israel Studies at University of Calgary. The title of this year's series is The Future of Our Histories, Recollecting the Past, Projecting the Future, and it is organized by Yuval Ivri and myself, Angie Cohen. The theme of this year's seminar is the scholarly frameworks from which to approach the diversity of Sephardi experiences of modernization and the social, political, and cultural implications of such frameworks. This year, we want to explore the multiplicity of identities at play in the different Sephardi experiences of modernity, and to rethink the disciplinary separations that inform our approaches to identity, history, and culture. As usual, I will summarize the argument of our last meeting and its connection to the previous, as to continue weaving the argument of this year's seminar through the different voices that participate in this space. In our last meeting, Yoram Lital shared part of his research on Egypt's Jewish heritage and spoke about the renewed interest in the country's Jewish past, placing the question of the nostalgia for the Jews and their absence in today's Egypt in the context of the present political, social, and social reality of the country, and more specifically in the context of the civic uprising of 2011 and the attempt to bring the downfall of the regime. Lital's lecture connected to some of the topics laid out by Ella Shochat in her dialogue with Yuval Ivri, the function of origins and the context of certain histories. Lital's lecture referred to the multiplicity of origin and heritages of Egypt, and the work done by the leadership of the currently tiny Egyptian Jewish community to pass on Egypt's Jewish legacy onto the next generation of Egyptians, under the assumption that the Jewish story is part of their heritage as Egyptians and not just a relic. For that past to be seen as their heritage, it has to have some sort of relevance in the present, something to contribute and a function to play. The material history of the Egyptian Jews is, according to Lital, a sort of living archive, an archive that continues to be filled by local cultural products and discourses that keep adding their share to the preservation of Egyptian Jewish memory. Today, we are welcoming Dr. Lital Belinko-Sabah, and with a lecture called "How do Judeo-Spanish proverbs and tales communicate with us, and how do we communicate with them?" Dr. Belinko-Sabah completed her PhD at the Hebrew University as a recipient of the prestigious Rothschild Doctoral Fellowship under the supervision of Dr. Aldina Quintana and Professor Khalid Hassan Rokem. In her research, which is soon to be published as a book by Peter Lang Publishing, she maps the language structures that act as markers for literary aspects in Judeo-Spanish folklore stories. Dr. Belinko-Sabah is a research fellow at the Israeli Proverb Collection at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, a linguist analyst in the high-tech company Personetics, and a board member of the Center for Victims of Sexual Assault in Jerusalem. Before we start, let me remind you that the seminar will be structured as usual: 45 minutes of presentation and half an hour of Q&A. I will be moderating the chat, so you're all welcome to write your questions there. If someone wishes to open their microphone and ask their question, you're more than welcome to do so. Just make sure to let us know on the chat and wait for your turn. Lital, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Angie, for the presentation and for the invitation. I'm very happy to be here. I'll share so I will start with a small introduction about Judeo-Spanish and my research. Judeo-Spanish, or in its other common names, Ladino or Judaismo, is still in use among the descendants of the Jews who were expelled from Spain. So in 1492, after the Alhambra Decree, the Jews immigrated to different areas. Some of them went to Portugal and Italy, only to be expelled again some years later. Many went to Turkey, which opened its borders to all the Jews who wanted to go there. others went to the Balkans. Since it was a big community who immigrated together in a very short time, their language preserved characteristics from the 15th century Spanish, Portuguese, and Italian, and was changed by the lexicon and grammar of completely different languages, such as the Semitic languages, Slavic languages, and Turkish. So since my second year as a BA student, I knew I wanted my research to show the connection between linguistics, literary, and folklore theories. And so when I thought about what I wanted to focus on my PhD thesis, Judeo-Spanish corpus was the obvious choice. It was the obvious choice because this is interesting language was already researched by linguists and folklorists, but no one ever saw the connection between the theories and how can each theory benefit from the other. This combination of theories can give us a better understanding of the use of linguistic features and a better understanding of the literary structure of the stories and the narrator's intentions. Judeo-Spanish is also perfect for that kind of research because of its richness in stories, dialects, and well-documented old texts. So in this presentation, I want to focus on the relationship between the narrator and the audience. There are numerous facets to this relationship in communication. I'll discuss two of them. The first is when the storyteller tries to convey a character's feeling without actually saying it. And the second is when the narrator picks which genres to tell, and as a result, changes the manner they tell the story. So, we also will talk about how difficult it is to interpret these messages when we're working with texts that were collected nearly a century ago and we don't have recordings, audio or visual recordings. And and an important fact is that all the pictures you're going to see in this presentation were taken from the Joseph and Margit Hoffman Judaica Postscript collection, which is kept at this moment at the Folklore Research Center at the Hebrew University. But you can also find them all in the National Library website. Okay. So the corpus I have worked on was compiled in the early 20th century and published between 1910 and 1935 from 8 distinct groups from 31 storytellers. The corpus contains 87 stories. You can see in this map, these are the communities the stories were collected from. So it was compiled by 6 researchers, Max Wagner, Walter Simon, Max Luria, Baruch Kalmi, and Cynthia Cruz. I'll begin by providing a brief overview of the text on which I've worked. So the first will show it's Max Wagner documented the stories in Salonika in 1914. He recorded the stories, but the recordings were lost in the Second World War, which is why we are left only with his transcriptions. Walter Simon texts were collected in Salonika between 1916 and 1918. His methods for gathering stories are unknown. He didn't mention them in his book. Baruch Kalmi, a Judeo-Spanish speaker, he published his thesis with this story in 1923, and he stated that he transcribed the narrative exactly as it was related to him, and that any errors were committed by the narrator. His only blunders were phonetics, as he couldn't tell the difference between O and E. And Max Luria collected the stories from Bitola, and then in 1926, as part of a comparative study, he handed the text to Judeo-Spanish speakers who immigrated to New York from Bitola, and he recorded them. So in 2009, Libel published the phonograms that Luria recorded, and Aldina Quintana transcribed the 18 stories recorded in the phonograms and published it together with Edwin Sarusi. And later you will hear a part of the recording, and you will see how difficult this work was, probably was. So the last one is Cynthia Cruz. She was a linguist and a Romanist who collected stories from 1930 to 1935, primarily in Salonika, but also in Bucharest, Skopje, and Sarajevo. Cruz did not record the discussions surrounding the narrative text. She wrote them she wrote some of them down while hearing the stories and added some from her memory after she returned home. So with all these different texts, how can we get knowledge regarding the use of words or verbs from text? We don't have the recordings for most of the texts, and we have different researchers, we have different communities. So let's start first and foremost. In this case of Luria text, we have no recordings from the initial and narrated stories, but we do have some recordings of the later readings by immigrants in New York. So if the texts were not properly recorded, we would expect considerably more stuttering and pausing on the part of the readers that he did recorded. So we will now listen to a recording, and you will see that there is a continuous reading here with the occasional changes of objects and verbs forms, and we will talk about it in a second. So just a second.
Tiempo había dos maleficios, y los dos moraban en la misma casa, una abajo y una arriba. El uno le hizo un mazal, ganaba más millones, y el otro ganaba poco, no tenía mazal. Un día ya arribó haciendo de pesa.
Okay. I'll stop it here. If you want to listen later to more of this recording, we will do this. But you can see that the left text is the original, is what Luria gave the immigrants to read, and then in the right side we have the recording. So you can see that we do have some differences. For example, he changes the désir to disho, so he did change the verb's form. He also changed the pronunciation from dia to die. He added things. If we had in the first text está diciendo, then in the recording we have está diciendo a su marido. He added things. He also omitted other things, and he changed from qualo to que. So we do see here changes in the story, but but all the readers did read it mostly fluently, so we can trust that the texts were pretty close to what it was in the original. So what we okay. So what about the other texts? So if I have 87 texts collected by 6 researchers from 31 storytellers and 8 different communities, and there are repeating phenomena, it's difficult to assume that they will all make the same mistake in the same way. In this context, it is extremely intriguing to locate stories collected from the same informant several years apart by various researchers and to see the difference between the accounts. The biggest difference is in how many details they tell the story, which is interesting because we can't find a lot of different linguistic features, which I'm happy about it, because then I can see that the linguistic features, they do have the features that I think they have, but they do tell some of the stories with less details. And I wonder if it is related to the gender of the interviewer or the age of the narrator, or perhaps the whole situation they tell the story. So the subject I'd like to address in this session is how we might identify the relationship between the narrator, the story, and the audience in text collected a century ago without surviving recordings. Hence, first and foremost, I'd like to focus on how we might comprehend the characters or narrators' reactions to what is happening in the stories. Then, while recounting the story, I'd like to focus on the narrator's intentions. The stories are frequently delivered from the perspective of an omniscient narrator, as if the narrator and the audience were gazing down at the event rather than through the eyes of one of the characters. So, but I will talk about internal focalization. So internal focalization occurs when the point of view in a folktale moves to one of the characters. The narrator is still delivering the story in these circumstances, but what they are saying represents one of the characters' point of view. Internal focalization is frequently associated with verbs of sense, emotion, or thought. By pointing out when the narrators turn to internal focalization, we may better comprehend first how the emotion can be depicted in Judeo-Spanish without articulating the feeling, and second, how particular language elements are used in narration. Okay, so the following formulas are and their applications will be explored in this session. I'll concentrate on formulations that don't clearly state the emotion, but are utilized to convey one. So the first one will be proverbs and idioms, and in particular, the use of a known formula within the stories to express fear. Second will be idiomatic phrases, and especially the use of a narratological formula to express fear and frustration. And the third, I will also discuss two syntactical formulas that express surprise and stress. Before discussing proverbs, I'd like to introduce the quick analytical method developed by Galit Hazan-Rokem. So Hazan-Rokem definition of a proverb is, as you can see, an ethnopoetic genre, which is a poetic and condensed summary of collective experience bearing a specific structure. The proverb is a concretization in poetic language of a structured expression of the norm system characterized by recurrent use. The second part of this definition can be realized only by the structural semantic analysis suggested by Hazan-Rokem. Every proverb is a universal sentence in the logical sense, which means that it is true for all individuals and or situations that can be related to the context of the proverb. Therefore, according to the rules of logic, the proverb has the deep structure of a conditional sentence. For example, the proverb that is said by the dead father to his children, can die in vida, come en muerte. He who gives in life, eats in death. The proverb's literal meaning is reflected in the translation, but its concrete meaning is charity prepares the way to heaven. Its logical deep structure expressed as a conditional phrase is, if a person gives charity, he will be rewarded in the afterlife. This proverb is manipulative, indicating that the father is attempting to instruct his children on how to behave in order to achieve the desired result. And because the conditional consequence is positive, we may comprehend that conduct is required of the father in the story, and thus of the culture in which this proverb is utilized. A semantic study of the proverb reveals the inner structure, which allows us to grasp what the narrator or speaker considers good or bad behavior and how they want the hearer to act. Proverbs can have varied meanings depending on the context. We can determine which characteristics a community considers good or bad by doing a comprehensive structural examination of proverbs within the context in which they are utilized. So proverbs that are considered internal focalizers are said by a character to himself. They are used mostly to describe the situation or justifying their own actions, but they are not trying to educate or change someone's behavior. So they are not manipulative in the same way that we saw the other proverb. By using the proverb in this way, we get a glimpse on the character's emotions and thoughts. Such is the effect of the following scene, where a rich man became poor in one day, and after a long story about what happened to him after he became poor, two men appeared with diamonds, looking for someone to buy them. They decided to leave the diamonds with him if he promises to give them the money he earned from selling the diamonds. So then, after 2 minutes, he met other men searching to buy diamonds. And after he sells them, the diamonds, we have this. Okay. Hicieron el trato I'm sorry, excuse me for my accent in Ladino, because I actually don't have an accent in Ladino. Oficiaron el trato, ¿cuánto es? Tomaron los diamantes y le dejaron la moneda. Agora el prove está diciendo, veladir que hay que yuldu. No abasta la vela, mos vino dos. Ine los diamantes me los podía guardar el pecho. Agora estas dos llaves de moneda, ¿dónde que las meta? Y un ladrón puede venir, me las puede llevar. You can read also the translation down. Okay, so first it is interesting to notice that the narrator says the proverb, but since the proverb is in Turkish, he feels the need to translate it. And another interesting thing is that the character explains the proverb. It's like he explains the proverb to himself, but actually, of course, it's the narrator explains it to the audience. But we don't usually get in stories where a character says a proverb and then explains it. So this is a great example for it. So in this context, the proverb parallels the saying, when it rains, it pours. The poor man is worried that the proverb is true. This proverb is usually used when someone is having a hard time and another person says this proverb as if to say that this is a fact of life. The deep structure of this proverb in that case, when the other person says it to the person that has a hard time, it will be if a person has many problems, the result is or bad or neutral, because this is how life is. But the character uses this proverb, but instead of describing his hardships as a fact of life, he uses it to express his fear that the proverb may be true. It is as if he is reminding himself of the truth of the proverb and the possibility of trouble coming in groups, because he had only one trouble. Now he fears that someone will come and steal it from him. So he just tells us about his fear. In this case, the tip structure is, if a person has a problem, the result is bad because another problem will occur, is coming. So the second proverb that is used as interfocalizer is an uncommon version of a common proverb. The proverb that we see in the story is like this: negro que negro, shema el carbonero. Se levantó el hombre y se fue. So here goes nothing worse than the bad shema of the demon. This proverbial sentence is said right after the main character made a deal with the demon. The better known version of this proverb is like this: negro que negro, shema Israel. Shema Israel is a verse from the book of Deuteronomy. It is considered a credo, a declaration of belief in God. It is recited by believing Jewish people every morning and every evening, and when a person believes death is imminent. Throughout history, there are numerous stories of people reciting the verse on their deathbeds and then miraculously being saved. In the context of this use, the common proverb may be interpreted as meaning Shema Israel is the dying person's last resort. Its deep structure will be, if a person is at a point at which all is lost, she or he will take the chance, or she or he has nothing to lose. So the proverb used here may be an unfamiliar version of the more common one, or the narrator's way to echo the known proverb. It is mostly understood in this way since there is no other context to indicate otherwise. But it also could be that the change from Shema Israel to Shema Carbonero changes the proverb to a curse. The proverb is said to convey the fear that the man has regarding his situation, but also to justify his actions to himself. So after the proverbs that express fear and worry, I shall present the idiomatic phrases. There are a couple of phrases that are commonly used in the corpus that express frustration. It is interesting that most of them appear in two main narrative situations. First, when a character leaves or is expelled from his or her home, and second, when they are frustrated and do not know what to do. But in all these things where they use these expressions where they don't know what to do, they are all before one of the peaks of the plot. Okay, so the most common formula is the rhetorical question, ¿qué que faga? What will he or she do? It signals frustration and it brings attention to a character's point of view. So here we have an example: cerraron el baño y quedó él adentro. El hombre ahora, ¿qué que faga? Se asentó en un cantonico del baño. We also have here with the ¿qué que faga the word agora, which is like ahora in Spanish. Agora also simultaneously marks the character's internal emotion experience in many parts of the narrative. So it is just fitting that the phrase with it, that it comes with que faga and they co-occur. Yeah, okay. So the second formula is the phrase no supo onde va ni onde viene. This phrase only appears when the character is expelled or runs away, and the formula holds the notion of frustration and fear. So we have here, Intementes ella se fue, no supo onde va ni onde viene, como nunca no salió de su casa. Now we move on to a different kind of formula. This is a syntactical formula, which means that the formula is the structure of the sentence and not specific words. Okay, so we have en lo que. So en lo que signals the temporal overlap between the durative action in the subordinate clause and the action that is introduced in the main sentence. So it's the overlap between a continuous action and an action that comes in the middle of it, and then they co-occur. So the meaning of en lo que is similar to that of mientras or cuando in some contexts in Spanish, which means while or meanwhile, but it is exclusively used in Judeo-Spanish, and no recordings of this use have been observed in history of the Spanish language. Since en lo que is about the temporal overlap of two actions, it is important to see which tenses appear in the subordinate clause and which ones in the main clause. When en lo que appears with the present progressive or past, and in the main clause there is the past, it always expresses a surprise. The example I will show comes from a story where the lady goes down the stairs to look for her husband, and as she's going down the stairs, a hole opens in front of her and she falls through it. This will lead her to the place where her real husband lies, and where she will save him from his curse. So when the surprising hole opens up, we have this. Esta salió para seguir a la oda. En lo que está yendo a la oda se abrió un buraco. En se abriendo este buraco ya cayó abajo 41 escalón. Okay, so this is a surprising effect. The second syntactical formula is used only when a new character is introduced to the scene. It appears when the character's appearance comes as a surprise or when it is expected but feared from. So na is a particle that originates from the Balkan languages, and its meaning is something around the voilà and voici in French, or hine in Hebrew, or lo in archaic English in the Bible's translation. So we have here, yo que salgo a la calle, na uno que me afera, aman señor Gevir, él ya se entiende en joya, no alcancé a dar 10 pasos, na otra gente que ya vinieron a mercar la joya y la vendí con buen precio. In this example, the encounter with the people was surprising and considered as a miracle. In the following example, the character Yagia was already mentioned in the story as a man that people should fear from. He is mentioned as a murderer and thief, and his wife is fears for that he comes back home. So now la mujer, la provereta, se fue triste a la culiva. Na Yagia que ya viene. That shows that the phrase with na actually may convey the feeling of being startled. It could be because of a surprise or because a person the character was afraid of just came. So this is middle conclusion, I showed the 3 kinds of formulas that are used within the stories to express emotions without explicitly saying the emotion. First, the use of proverbs and idioms when characters say them to themselves. Since they are said as a self-reminder, they are not manipulative, but rather descriptive of the situation. They can describe the physical situation, but mostly they express fear and worry. Second, the use of idiomatic phrases to give an internal focalization on what the character is feeling. I brought 2 examples that show frustration and fear. Both are used mainly when a character leaves his or her home, but kekefaga can also be used in frustration before a peak in the plot. And lastly, the use of syntactical formulas. The first with enloke is used to express a surprise, but only when it appears with preterite or present, with past or present progressive in the subordinate clause. And the second, okay, here it shows surprise. And the second with na is used when a character appears by surprise, or a character that was feared from is arriving, and thus it expressed fear. So surprise and fear. Okay, so thus far, we've discussed the relationship between the narrative and the audience. But what about the relationship between the narrator and the audience? Now I would like to discuss the genres of some of the stories, since the classification to genres may help us understand what are the narrator's intentions, and second, may help us as researchers to communicate with each other about this topic. So in this corpus, I found mainly the following genres: fairy tales, novellas, legends, ethical tales, fables, and humorous tales. We will talk about them. You will see the titles. You don't have to remember all of them. So fables and ethical tales are moral stories, which implies that the person who tells them has a lesson to teach about how people should and should not behave. The distinction between the two is that fables are frequently about animals, and their structure is the body of the story with the moral in the form of a statement at the end, usually a proverb. And ethical tales are stories concerning brothers, sisters, or neighbors who differ in one key aspect. One may be wealthy while the other is impoverished. One may be Jewish while the other is not. Or one may be charitable and well-mannered while the other is greedy and ill-mannered. The structure is always the same. The story begins with an orientation when they say what are the characters and what is the difference between them. And then it follows by part 1, which tells the hero's story. So, I'm sorry. Then the villain then learns how the hero obtained her or his power or reward. And part 2 addresses the villain's attempt to replicate the experience in the hero's story and get punished. And finally, we have the resolution. And they say, ellos tengan bien, vosotros también. Okay, so the most popular genres in the corpus are folktales, legends, and novellas, which are typically lengthier than the other genres. It's worth noting that folktales, legend, and novellas have thematic variances, but linguistically, they're not so different. And those who know these stories won't mind if someone calls a folktale a novella and the novella a folktale. So in these cases, it feels like the difference between genres is mostly for research, so we can understand what we're talking about, but I don't think that the community will care if somebody will say legend or folktale. And we can see it also in Hebrew when people say Agadot Achim Grimm, the legends of Grimm's brothers, while we know that these are fairy tales as researchers, but nobody cares. So on the other hand, if someone calls a joke a folktale or vice versa, it is more likely that they will be corrected. So a narrative does not have to be told in the same genre every time it is told. It is usual for a story to go from a fairy tale to a novella or a legend. For example, if I want to relate a witch story to children who are afraid of witches, I may modify the witch to a bad fate or just a terrible person and eliminate the magic from the story. But as previously stated, there are no linguistic structural differences between folktales, legends, and novellas. Okay, now about the humorous tales, according to the Vidnavon's definitions, humorous stories are structurally distinct from other genres. The humorous story is a long joke, a short story, in which the audience's expectations are shattered by the protagonist's unexpected response to a problem. When there are two or more ways to understand the issue and one or more characters understand and does the opposite of what the viewer would expect based on cultural traditions, the unexpected solution occurs and makes the punchline. And the formats of the humorous stories vary. They might be entirely conversational or can include narrated passages. They are typically shorter than the other genres, with the plot taking place over the length of one scene or two tops. The humorous tale is frequently about Jocha, a well-known figure in humorous tales in Judeo-Spanish, but although it may also be about nameless individual. What makes all of these stories amusing is that they all include a punchline that usually resolves the tension in a plausible but surprising way. The punchline is always delivered in the form of a quote or its explanation. I always feel that when I explain about humorous tales, when people say, when you explain a joke, it stops being funny. So I feel like I'm doing it now for all the jokes in the world when I explain how jokes work. So now that we've talked about a bit about the genres, I would like to show a nice example about what do I mean that a story can be delivered in different genres. So when we have a story like the one about King Kabasakal, which means a long-bearded or a thick-bearded king, and is known from the Sanhedrin as Avdakan. In this story, the king overhears his vizier telling a merchant that he's full Kabal Sakal, or the king asks him why he said that, and the vizier tells him that whomever is Kabal Sakal is stupid. The king challenges him to prove it, or he will kill him. So, which he achieves it by forcing someone else to act irrationally in front of the king. The king agrees that this is proof, so he checks his beard in the middle of the night, notices that it is excessively long, and chooses to burn it. But before I read it, the passage here, I want each and every one to think while we read this verse, what feelings do you feel at the end of the story? I will read, I think, the Judeo-Spanish verse, but whoever doesn't understand, you can read the English one. So, a la noche, en lo que ya se durmieron todos, a medianoche, se levantó el rey, se mesuró la barba con los puños, contó 3,5 puntos, le sobró mucho, se fue a la candela que había ascendiendo, metió los puños en la barba y el resto lo tomó a quemar. En lo que ya se ascendió la barba, se quemó la mano. Trabó la una mano, se quemó y la segunda mano. Trabó y la segunda mano, se ascendió la barba entera. Se quemó los mustachos y los cabellos de la cabeza. Al día se levantó avergonzando, lo llamó al vizir, le dijo, en este hal me trujiste. Le dijo el vizir, si no vos hacía esto, me ibas a matar. Con esto, en presentamiento. Le dijo el rey, Gozun Gormesin. Le enviaron Surgun al vizir y el rey quedó sin cabellos, porque era Kabasa Karajmak. Ellos tengan bien y nosotros también. So now, well, I read it also with a bit of intonation, but remember what you thought about whether it was stress, tension, amusement, and I want to show you another story, not in Judeo-Spanish, but in Hebrew. So now the same idea about the thick-bearded man who finds out about this saying, but it is told in a different genre from a different community. I will read it in Hebrew also, and whoever doesn't understand Hebrew, you can read it in English. So עבדכן ישב ולמד בלילה מסכת סנהדרין לאור הנר. למד ולמד והגיע למה שאמרו עבדכן סקסן.
For economical reasons, because she couldn't get an apartment.
Okay, I'm sorry. So, עיין ברש"י ומצא מי שזקנו עבה שותה הוא.
My father always said, people can have different opinions.
אוקיי, חלשה דעתו, מה תקנה יש לו? לגזוז את הזקן אסור, להניחו כמו שהוא, הרי הוא מעיד עליו. נמלח ומדד שני טפחים זקן, והשאר הגיש לנר דולק. מיד השתלבה האש, צרפה כל זקנו וגם חרכה פניו. עמד הנשרף וכתב בגמרא מן הצד, בדוק ומנוסה. This text was taken from the book of jokes written by Alter Droyanov. So here you can compare and see how the same idea can be once a story and in other community, a humorous tale. The difference between a fairy tale and a humorous tale is obvious, even when the fairy tale has some amusing elements. But when talking about the difference between a fairy tale and a legend, the difference is not that obvious anymore. In general, a fairy tale is a story occurring in an imaginary rather than a real or realistic location, and in an imagined time with typological or symbolical figures such as kings, queens, princes and princesses, or even King Solomon. In them, witches and magical animals appear. In legends, miracles are more common than magic, and they are more likely to occur in the world we know. So these definitions are not as simple as they appear, and it is usually easier to discuss these two genres as a scale rather than a dichotomous system. Hence, when the narrator tries to make the story more realistic, not so much so that people will believe that it actually happened, but rather so that people will be more engaged with the story, they will use sentences such as the following examples. In a story where when the princess is a goat that transforms into a lovely princess only at night, the narrator stops the story twice to say this. Al tiempo, los turcos se casaron todos presto. So this story is obviously not taken as a true story by the audience, but the narrator says this sentence that is like a historical fact. The second quote comes from a tale that explains why men rule over animals rather than the other way around. And in this story, the animals communicate with humans, indicating that it is not a true event. And then it says, ya sabemos que los animales no tienen médicos, y cómo se sanen, la madre con la lengua se lo lambe y lo amaje. So here, the narrator gives a fact of how the world works, a fact about nature, while the story is obviously not true. Although that in this instance, it might have been told as things that happened in this world when there used to be magic, because there are tales that have elements of magic, but are told as if they happened before a point in time that made all magic go away. So these are stories that are part fairy tales, part legend, and part a myth. And the sentence that the narrator used made all these genres a possibility. Okay, so I don't have the ending, but what I want to talk about was also, I want to say that my next project, what I want to work next is to work on more texts from other communities, from other period of time, texts also from Me'am Lo'ez, and to see even more to see if the linguistic features I found, because I worked only on 87 stories, and to see if they also work in other communities in other times, and to understand Judeo-Spanish better. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Lital, for this wonderful, wonderful talk. There are a couple questions. The first one is from Yitzhak Kerem, and I will write unless he wants to read his question by himself. Do you want to read your question by yourself, or should I just read it? Yeah, okay, I'll go ahead. So Itzhak says, I used Judeo-Spanish for 40 some years after several years of linguistic studies. This is the first time I hear the discrepancy between the literal meaning and the used meaning of the proverb. What factors serve the discrepancy between the literal meaning and the use of the proverb? Linguistically, why is there this discrepancy? Limits of the lexicon of Judeo-Spanish. How was the practical use of the proverb formulated? I view the proverb as a masha, a cliché, or a euphemism, but none of these classifications seem enough encompassing. Roquem's definition seems incomplete. The proverb is more than a colloquial rehashing. The proverbs express some 2,000 years of Jewish terms, often Aramaic terms, loan ideas as opposed to ulterior loan words, and more. Any further expectations or commentaries? And he leaves his email in case you want to address this in more detail personally. Oh, sorry, he meant a mashal. He views the proverb also as a mashal. And then he also adds a little further any explanations of the discrepancy between literal meaning and the moral tale fable. That's Itzhak Kerem. I'm going, and there's a couple more questions. So if you don't mind, I'll ask you, and then you can answer them all. There's another one from Amina Bukail. Thank you for your interesting presentation. I want to ask you about the nature of the Hebrew words can be used in Judeo-Spanish proverbs. I'm not sure I understand the question, but maybe you do. And I think this is it from the chat. So maybe you want to answer, and I will ask you a couple of questions myself.
Okay. Sorry, it's a bit long. I'm okay.
Yeah, you can read it.
So,
Yeah,
determining, I'm not sure, perhaps I didn't explain myself well. The discrepancy between the literal meaning and the used meaning, I meant the literal meaning as if because Proverbs use metaphor. So that's what I meant, like the literal meaning what each word meant, what meant the metaphor, and then when I said about the how they use it, because what its meaning in the actual context. That's what what I meant, and meaning and the use of the proverb. Yeah, so it's not a discrepancy, linguistic discrepancy. It just the use of them. It's how people use them. It is interesting linguistically only because from linguistic point of view, we will look how the literary meaning alone, because we want and research what it meant as a metaphorical thing, as the deep meaning of it. The deep meaning of it is only literary. Okay, so you said also about that Roquem's definition seems incomplete. I can see how it looks like that. It's not exactly the definition of it is the definition of how proverbs work, but there are many definitions, and I thought about bringing my favorites one because there are many of them. There is Taylor's definition that he says that we can't say what is a proverb and what is not. It is an unexplained phenomena that every person in the community can say, oh, this is a proverb and this is not. This is what Taylor said, and actually it's very I think it's correct, but it doesn't give us a real definition. But we also have the scale definition, which means when we give, they say if the proverb is the phrase is archaic, or if it rhymes, or if it has, or if it is used in many contexts, and in many cultural, in other communities. So as many, if a phrase has many of these characteristics, it is more proverbial than other phrases. I actually really like this definition because then because it does gives us a scale, and I think that it gathered most of the proverbs that I saw in the text. It's more than a colloquial. Okay, yeah. I'm sorry if I missed something here. Okay, if I missed something, so please tell me. And I want to ask you about the nature of the Hebrew words. I don't really understand. If you want to explain better, you can. But from what I understand is if they use Hebrew words in the phrases, it's like I said, that if a proverb uses archaic language, so it's more proverbial. It's the same in Judeo-Spanish when they use Hebrew. Although they do use Hebrew also in their when they talk, they do have Hebrew words. But when it is in Proverbs, it gives it like another punch, that it is a proverbial thing. That's what I can say about this. I see that there are other.
Yeah, there are other questions. I'm going to ask you a couple questions myself, and I will gather the next questions that came in. So my questions are a little more general, and I was wondering about the place of proverbs and folk tales today. I was wondering about your thoughts on the relevance of these proverbs and tales for us, and the relevance for our relationship with the previous generation. On the one hand, and this has to do with the second part of the title of your talk. How do we communicate with them? And where does this meet us? On the one hand, and on the other hand, in terms of our interest in the seminar series, I was wondering about what you think that the contribution may be of the linguistic analysis for our understanding of culture, and more specifically, the contribution of linguistic analysis about to the methods needed to understand Sephardic experiences of modernity.
Okay, thank you for the question. So so first, how do we see this? You meant the proverbs in the narratives, and how do we?
Yeah, what do you think the relevance is for our relationship as researchers, as people, with the previous generation? What does this say about us today? What does this say about our relationship with the what do we do with this in terms of our understanding of the Sephardic experiences of modernization, but also in terms of our own process of modernization?
Yeah, so I really like this question. It relates to our old conversation.
Yeah,
because when someone tells a story, I think they usually, if they tell fairy tales, let's say, so they usually want to amuse the people. They want to pass the time. It's a nice story to have when people are around. But when they use the proverbs, or when someone uses the proverbs, even not in narrative, it has more of it has strength. It has asmachta. I don't know how to say how you say it. Asmachta, like it has it gives the person
authority.
Authority. Thank you. It's like it gives authority. It gives the person also a special stage when they use a proverb, when they know a proverb, and it has something even even though the stories are things that pass from one generation to another, when someone uses a proverb, it has more feeling of nostalgic. It has more feeling of old times and what the old people would say and what did they say in old generations. And it brings all of it back to us. And that is also something that is really amazing, because in these stories that I worked with, there were a couple of proverbs that it is obvious they are proverbs, because they say, como dice el refrán, or they say, or you see it's a proverb because it's metaphorical to the situation. But when I ask people and when I search in books, nobody knows this proverb anymore. It's a lost proverbs, let's say. Nobody understands, and we don't even understand exactly its meaning. So our communication with the modernity, let's say, like now we have everything, or we try to have everything categorized, and we try to preserve now, because we understand now the loss when we don't keep the old text, and when we don't keep the things together. And when I read the stories, and I also, and I guess, well, people from that community, when they read the stories and they read these proverbs, so it's nostalgic, but it's also a loss. It's something that we do have the documentation of it, but we don't understand all of it. So yeah, that it's a bit sad for me. I feel it like since my BA, I always work with ancient texts from ancient Egyptian and Ladino now. Well, Ladino, it's not that ancient, but still we get those texts and we can't completely understand everything, especially with proverbs that are metaphorical and not always explained. So, and yeah, and I'm sorry, but what was the second question?
The relevance or the importance, in your opinion, again, is not I'm just wondering, in your opinion, the relevance or the importance of literary analysis for our of linguistic analysis for our understanding of the Sephardic experience of modernization.
Yeah.
Like in terms of the it's also fine if you know, if you don't think that that's a relevant question. That's the kind of questions that I'm thinking about.
Yeah, no, I like this question because it does give us what I like to do now, and this is also my what I said I want to research next, because there are people that tell stories in Judeo-Spanish right now, and what is amazing is that they put it on the internet, they put it in YouTube, they put it in Facebook.
That is amazing,
and you can see it, and that's great. And I hear these stories, and after reading all these old stories, there is something related and something new and something different. But there are storytellers, there are genuine storytellers these days in Judeo-Spanish. So what we can understand from it, I think, it's how Judeo-Spanish actually changed since it was in the Balkans and in Istanbul, and now how it is when we use it in Israel. Well, most of them are in Israel, not all of them, but most of them, I think, well, the people that I saw on YouTube and Facebook, most of them are from Israel, and how they use it now, the Judeo-Spanish, which is also, I wonder, and this is what I want to also do next, to ask them, like, I'm not sure if they talk Judeo-Spanish among their friends, among their family. I think they use it more as traditionally, like telling the story, doing this thing on the internet because they want to preserve it. They want to have this nostalgic idea, but they don't use it every day. So this is how I think that the linguistic analysis can help us understand how and it also perhaps will show us the changes that can be made, perhaps, well, in every language, but Judeo-Spanish, especially from a language that was an everyday language to a language that is now used only traditionally, in some cases, not every day. So
yeah, I think that the question of nostalgia, which is it's a theme that keeps coming up in the seminar, like as we said last time and the one before, Deborah Starr and Yale Sagib Bizawi used a very interesting expression last year. They spoke about nostalgia as critique. So nostalgia can also be critique. It can be also a way of saying something about our world today, and not only say an idealized representation of the past, but something that wants to say something relevant about the present as well, and about, and maybe in this case about this loss that you were talking about. How is and to give continuity to that is I think, yeah, it can be something more than just nostalgia in the sense of idealization, and more maybe something more connected to resistance, resisting this loss, or resistance against this loss. But
I love this. No, it's also a lot in their conversation when they talk about Judeo-Spanish, and they say like what you can say and what you're not, and what you can't say. So it is something about really, it really connects to what you say, because it is nostalgic, like the ideology language that we think that we need to talk about, to talk how we need to talk, but also there is the language today and how they talk, because they can't preserve what was. They can't fully preserve, which is good, because if they can't preserve it exactly, it means that it's still alive.
Yeah, and that there's a future. Yeah. Yes. Oh. Okay, there's a few more questions. Vardit Lightstone says, thanks for the great talk. I have two questions. One is about Proverbs. Are there other situations or conflict, emotional or interpersonal conflict, in which they are used in these stories? The second question is regarding genre. You talk about the crossover between genres in several tale types. I was wondering if there is any material in this corpus that crosses genres with personal narratives, personal experience stories, such as historical or humorous tales.
Great.
That's one. Then Mark Shanker says, I am the author of Traces of Sepharad, Ways of Sepharad, etching of Judeo-Spanish Proverbs, comprised of 45 etchings by Mark Shanker, with essays by Spanish novelist Antonio Muñoz Molina and Sephardi biblical scholar T.A. Perry. Okay.
Thank you for being here.
Yes. Pam said, I don't know if I said that correctly. I analyzed Judeo-Spanish proverbs and their relationship to Ottoman proverbs in my article, Que haber ni haber, linguistic interference, cross-meaning, and lexical borrowing between Ottoman Turkish and Judeo-Spanish. In Sepharad as Imagined Community, edited by Mahir Shahul and José Ignacio Walde. Thank you for a very interesting talk.
Thank you.
Viviana de la Rosa says, I'm not quite sure, it's lost or nostalgic. Linguistically speaking, the language is organic, it evolves, making applicable to the present. Judy Kropp, thank you so much. This was fascinating.
Thank you. So I will start with what Viviana wrote, because I think she wrote it before we finished the conversation about it, because this is exactly what we said, that that's right. It's not lost. It is developing. And it's good if it's developing. That's a good thing, and they should embrace it. I see also that Itzhak Kerem wrote about what is the role of the Midrash in the narrative.
Oh, that's right. Sorry, I'm sorry.
No, it's okay. It is legendary, but not factual or even earthly, and often it is supernatural. So this is a great question, and I didn't really work on the Midrash. Well, actually, Galit Chazan Rokem, she wrote a book about the genres in the Midrash. but I think that I need to see it more, to research it more, to look at it. And Vardit also, right? So she, I'm very happy you're here, Vardit. So are there other situations? Yeah, there are other situations that we see proverbs in the story, but not as internal focalized like I talked about. More about proverbs that are said from one character to another, or a proverb that is said by the narrator to the audience, like he or she stops the story and they say a proverb as a conclusion, or perhaps to explain something. So, but there are situations, but mostly they are manipulative. When a character says it to another character, they tell this proverb like, you need to do it, you need to work like this, you need to do this, or to give an advice. And it's interesting that when the narrator says it to the audience, it's usually to misguide the audience, because the beginning of the story, the person gets a lot of money, and then the narrator says, how he says it, quien tenga moneda camine como león, or todo le da shalom. So it is like a great thing that you have a lot of money, but then right after that, something bad happens because they have a lot of money. One of them has a lot of money, so his wife uses all this money, and then she cheated on him, and then his life falls apart. So it's like it's a bit it's interesting that they use it to misguide the audience about these proverbs, like to show us that this proverb is not true. And your second question, well, I didn't work on personal narratives, although that in the corpus that I did work on, there were some stories that were collected that were personal narratives. I thought, but two of them, they were very obviously, they were like legends, but they were told in first person. But I didn't use them because I wanted to use only stories that were told in third person to have the right comparison. But it is an interesting story. It is an interesting question. So perhaps for my following research, I will add this also. Yeah.
So I think, yeah, Verdit just answered. But you have a message from Cynthia Gabay saying, thanks, Lital, congratulations. And Vardit Lightstone says, thank you. I appreciate your focus on focalization regarding the use of proverbs in the material and the way it relates to how proverbs are mobilized.
Okay, thank you.
And she adds, very good to know about the personal narratives. I hope you get to work on them in the future. Yeah, I hope so too. That'd be super interesting.
Well, I'll talk to you about it if I'll do it.
Nice. I don't know if there are any other questions or any other comments. I remind you that you're all welcome to open your microphones and ask Lital a question or share with her a thought, a comment that you have after listening to her. And otherwise, I think we may be done. This was very, very interesting. Very, very interesting. Thank you so much for your time and for sharing with us part of your research. If there are no other comments, I will. I hope to see you all in our next meeting of the seminar series, in which Dr. Aviad Moreno and myself will be speaking about questions related to modernization and the case of Spanish Moroccan Jews. So you are all very welcome to join us. That will be on April 18th. And you will all receive a recording of this fantastic seminar. And again, thank you all for participating. Thank you, Lital, for your work and for your generosity.
Thank you very much. Thank you for inviting me.
Bye-bye, everyone.
Bye.